The Sith Order have tried to dominate their enemies through overwhelming firepower since the very beginning of their inception. In the time of the ancient Sith, around 5000 BBY, one had to outwardly display their power in order to gain respect and to keep it. This was when the feudal lords of the Sith amassed their own private navies to represent their name. And when it came to the golden age of the Empire, when they went to war with the Old Republic, these Sith Lords pooled all their resources to create an armada that would share their ideologies of strength to the rest of the galaxy. And so despite most ships of the era being incredibly primitive, the Sith would arrive on the scene with ships so powerful that they were still considered dangerous in the modern era of the galaxy. Greetings lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. In today's holocron, we are going to examine the Sith ships of the Great Hyperspace War, which were so ahead of their time that even Darth Revan would use their designs over 2 millennia past their expiration. But speaking of ancient Sith designs that refuse to die, we have some Sith drip of our own returning from the depths of the archives. For the holidays, Star Wars merch is 30% off site-wide with an extra 15% off using code WAVE. So if you want to outfit yourself like a proper Dark Lord, or flex some Sith swag worthy of Naga Sadow's royal fleet, now is the perfect time. Link in the description down below. Now my friends, let's open the holocron. Too often the Sith are spoken about in terms of what they conquered and destroyed, when in reality they were brilliant creators and inventors as well. Their entire philosophy was self-improvement through struggle, and because of this, the Sith became innovators in this ancient era of the stars. After all, the very first modern lightsaber appeared in the hands of the very first Dark Lords. While the Jedi were still using cable-powered proto-sabers, Ajunta Pal and his followers had discovered and figured out how to integrate a power cell within the hilt itself. It would be another roughly 2,000 years before the Jedi would ever gain that technological advancement. In much the same way, the Sith had the lead on starship designs as well. Unsurprisingly, they were a dominant force in naval combat during the Great Hyperspace War. In the most primal days of the Sith Purebloods, the Sith were unable to achieve interstellar travel until the Rakatan Infinite Empire invaded their homeworld. Under the leadership of King Adis, the Sith were able to beat back their much more technologically advanced attackers and took control of their ships and their technologies. Following this, they reproduced technology for themselves, enabling them to make ships that could leave their own atmosphere. It didn't take long for the warlike Sith to eventually weaponize these new machines. Our first real description of a Sith starship comes from the time of Naga Sadow. This is the golden age of the Sith, thus ushered in by Marka Ragnos, who has conquered vast quantities of space and made the Empire wealthy and prosperous. But after Marka Ragnos died, Naga Sadow insisted that the Empire needed to continue rapid expansion in order to maintain this prosperity. Sadow believed that now was the time to attack the waiting Republic. His political opponent Ludo Kresh vied for a more conservative approach, however, and stated that they should keep to themselves in order to preserve what Marka Ragnos had built. But the chance arrival of the ship known as the Starbreaker 12 ended all debate. This was a ship who was piloted by 2 Republic hyperspace explorers by the name of Gav and Jory Darragon. The 2 explorers had landed on Korriban by mistake. Sadow twisted their arrival into something like a preemptive strike from the Republic. By inspiring fear in the Dark Council of this era, Sadow was voted in as the next Dark Lord. Once this occurred, he took his fleet and merged it with all of the other lords of the council, and then the Sith went to war. In order to capture just how ahead of their time the Sith actually were, the ships of this era were relatively primitive. While hyperdrive technology was well in use by this time, the ships themselves were still a bit rustic on the technological advancement side. For instance, the ships were not able to go through landing sequences by themselves. They had ropes that were deployed from the underside of the vessels that a whole entire crew had to use in order to help the ships land. Most of the vessels were also more organic looking, with wings and fins decorating their sides. The Sith followed these designs but introduced several upgrades. This was done only because of the expert craftsmanship of the Zaguruk builders. The Zaguruk were the craftsmen and the artisans of the ancient empire. Long ago, their talents had been mostly put towards the construction of the Grand Tombs, but when Ajunta Pal and the Dark Jedi took over, they repurposed the Zaguruk into the construction of ships and weapons instead. One of those ships was called the Omen. It is the sister ship of the Harbinger. These were the dreadnaughts that required a crew of about 300, which was massive for the time. Sadow had tasked these ships with mining lignin ore to be used and repurposed against the Republic, but during their route, they were attacked by Jedi starfighters. The Harbinger was damaged, causing it to ram into the Omen and get sent off deep into hyperspace. The Omen crash landed on a world known as Kesh, which trapped its crew there. The Sith from the Omen would subjugate the world that they were now forced to live upon, becoming what is known as the Lost Tribe of the Sith. The Harbinger, however, had a bad reaction due to its damaged hyperdrive interacting with the lignin ore. In a freak accident, the ship was propelled 5,000 years into the future, where it emerged during the era of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Praxium. Despite being of ancient design, the Harbinger's weapon system still posed a significant threat to the advanced ships of the year of 41 ABY. This feat is massive, since the New Republic ships of this time had been developed around countering Imperial-level Star Destroyers. And while this is impressive, this is nothing. The most powerful and prominent of the ship warships of this era was the Derriphan-class battleship. The Derriphan is the primary capital ship used by the Old Empire, and they were carried by all of the most powerful Sith Lords of the era, including Naga Sadow and Ludo Kresh. The word Derriphan is the ancient Sith tongue which means devourer. The battleship was named after a dark side creature that was capable of consuming the thoughts and experiences of other living creatures, leaving behind nothing but an empty husk. The idea was that these vessels devoured the lives of any being that stood in their way. They were about 215 meters in length, which for reference is roughly a fifth of the length of a Republic Venator-class Star Destroyer. By more modern standards, they were fairly small and slow, but in their heyday, they were some of the most powerful and fearsome battleships that the galaxy had seen. Deflector shield technology did not exist in this time, but it was mostly designed to absorb heat and radiation encountered in space, and upon re-entry to planetary orbit, it was unknown if deflector shields had been improved to the point of military stability. Either way, the Derriphan-class battleship did not use deflector shields, but instead opted for incredibly powerful armoring. It is said that just a single Derriphan would succumb to the firepower of no less than 6 Republic warships. When it comes to armament, the Derriphan was loaded out with 6 autoblasters, 3 on the starboard side and 3 on the port. Autoblasters were the archaic ancestors of the turboblasters, and were specifically pioneered again by the Sith. They unfortunately were not very accurate, but they were extremely powerful and would shred through the hulls of any ship they came into contact with. The Sith admirals employed this tactic of using the Derriphan's powerful armor in order to get as close to the enemy fleet as possible, before unleashing a hailstorm of broadside cannon fire from their autoblasters. They were also outfitted with 3 heavy concussion missile launchers on the front and typically carried a payload of about 60 missiles. For the time, this was one of the most heavily armored ships ever conceived. Their small size allowed them to be crewed pretty sparsely too, as it only required about 25 men to properly crew the ship. However, it had enough space to house up to 850 passengers. When Darth Revan gained control of the Starforge, he fed the superweapon schematics for many of the Republic's vessels, those that he was more used to commanding. But as homage to the Sith Empire of yore, Revan also had the Starforge produce several Derriphan-class battleships. Despite being woefully outdated, they served him surprisingly well during the Jedi Civil War. The ships were meant to be more symbolic, but only proved that the Sith craftsmanship would still endure. Information on Sith starfighters is small, but it does exist. These snub fighters resembled dragons due to having an arched back with segmented armor plating and fins running along the spine. On either side were organic-looking wings, which were supported by very long twin blaster cannons. It is wise to assume that most like the Derriphan, the armor did most of the defending rather than having deflector shields. But it seems like the Sith weren't as confident in these starfighters as their other ships, or they just paid them little mind. The fighters were only ever deployed as a means of extra protection for the capital ships rather than as dogfight weaponry. Because of this, most of the Jedi pilots dominated them in combat. We believe they were called Blade-class starfighters, but we aren't sure if the ship we described and the Blade class are the same starfighter. Moving on though, the most powerful Derriphan-class battleship to ever exist was the Corsair, Naga Sadow's flagship. The Corsair was modified by Sadow himself, and could only be piloted by a Sith sorcerer. This was done by tapping into an array of Force-enchanted magic crystals that took the place of the main console. Utilizing these crystals, the ship had the ability to pull the heart out of stars, therefore powering the ship's weapon system. Through Sith magic, the pilot of the Corsair could control stars to a certain extent as well, causing solar flares or even making them go supernova. When the Sith Empire fell, Naga Sadow fled the Republic in this same vessel, hoping to cover his escape with a solar flare. He then buried the ship on Yavin 4. But this is not the end, as the Corsair was later discovered by Exar Kun, who in turn adopted it as his own flagship. However, he deceived one of his treacherous followers into using the Corsair at the Kron cluster. This was a collection of 10 unstable stars that were positioned near the world of Ossus. By pulling the hearts out of these stars in order to power the ship, it caused them to all go supernova. This of course destroyed the Corsair, but it rid Exar of his treacherous subordinate, and it devastated the surface planet of Ossus, destroying the home of the Jedi. This wasn't the only use of Sith magic that Naga Sadow employed with his fleet. Among his grand array of warships, he placed his Sith meditation sphere. This took the appearance of a giant yellow globe with wings like bats on either side of a glass eye-shaped viewport. Several crystalline communication antennae extended from the top and the bottom of the globe. This structure hung back on a distant moon, while the main fleet engaged with the enemy. Within the sphere, Sadow would meditate and aid his armada with the powers of the dark side. This took the form of dark side battle meditation. This plagued the thoughts of the enemy with fear and doubt, and caused them to become sloppy and uncoordinated. But Sadow himself mostly used it in order to cast illusions from long distances. He either conjured images of terrifying creatures or visually multiplied the number of his ships to make his fleet look twice as fearsome. This was the MO for the Sith of this era. They used overwhelming firepower supplemented by their dark side magic. This is what made them so unique and so terrifying. Not only were they technologically superior to their contemporaries, but they decided to bring a piece of home to every battle. Illusions, plagues, dark rituals, superweapons. This is all what they used to undermine their enemy. Their fleet was already too strong even in a fair fight, but Naga Sadow made sure the scales were all the way in his favor by stacking on his own esoteric knowledge. Supplementing armed forces with dark magic sort of feels like a lost art of the Sith. Emperor Vitiate, who was a product of the Golden Age, had his empire do this during the Great Galactic War, but after this point, we don't ever see the Sith utilize it again. Darth Sidious championed the Sith, leading others that were blind to the Force in combat, but even he didn't employ magic in combat as often as the Ancients did. Most of his dark side influence was done in much more subtle ways, or through the use of artifacts and machines. But he did take inspiration from his ancestors by making sure that his empire had the largest and the baddest ships in the entire galaxy. But anyway, my friends, this was our exploration of the warships of the ancient, golden age of the Sith Empire. I feel like this era is still ripe for exploration, and deserves much more than a handful of comics. It would be amazing to see a more primal sort of naval combat in the galaxy. It would be like a ship battle during our own world's golden age of piracy, but with hovering spacecrafts and magic weaponry. But something that we often forget when buried beneath all of the terror and destruction is that the Sith of the Golden Era were not just simple conquerors. They were brilliant inventors and visionary thinkers as well. This period illustrated a truth that the Jedi of the time refused to acknowledge, and that later generations attempted desperately to forget. The Sith were always innovators. Their obsession with strength pushed them into fields the Jedi never dared to approach: engineering, alchemy, science, starship design that blended machinery with sorcery. The same minds that forged superweapons and meditation spheres were also refining hyperdrives, experimenting with power systems centuries ahead of the Republic, and creating armored vessels so durable that even millennia later they posed a real threat to modern fleets. These ships were not merely instruments of war. They were the culmination of the Sith genius, shaped by artisans who believed that creation was another battlefield, and that victory belonged to those who could imagine what others feared. The Golden Age did more than empower the Sith. It revealed what the Sith were capable of when unrestrained by doctrine or fear. Their fleets were monuments of truth, carrying both their brutality and their brilliance deep into the stars. But truly, thank you all for supporting the channel. It allows us to keep these archives open, let us keep diving into the forgotten eras of the Star Wars galaxy, and makes it possible to bring you more Sith history that the Republic has tried to erase. I'm grateful for anyone who watched the video, and to everyone who checks out the Sith swag. It helps continue to fuel this channel's journey deep through the galaxy. And as always, may the Force be with you.